Lesson number 8, vain worship. Now, for a change, I'm not gonna stay on the title for half an hour. I'm just gonna get right into the commentary here real quick. In this lesson, the precept is worship. In the Bible context, worship is the exercise of love, devotion, and reverence towards God. As the lesson title indicates, all worship is not true worship. True worship must be a genuine, conscious, sincere expression of love, devotion, and reverence toward God in all His persons for all He is and does. Now, devotion. Does anyone remember last week's lesson, what devotion means? Wholly given for destruction, 100% surrender to God's will in all things. Vain worship is any profession or action that does not answer to the definition of true worship. Vain is the adjective for the noun vanity. Webster defines vanity as anything or act that is vain or conceited, having an exaggerated opinion of oneself, one's merits, etc. When we apply this definition to worship, we have something of a monstrosity, meaning the one meaning of which is something hideously wrong as evil. Another definition of vanity is producing no results, empty, useless. This also is very revealing, since vain worship will expose itself by its lack of spiritual benefit. Now, much has been said lately about the church's inability to discern problems, as well as the lack of open, life-changing miracles being seen around us. Miracles which would strengthen our faith and draw unsaved toward a desire for a knowledge of the truth. This is what happened in the days of Jesus and in the days of His disciples after Him. What about today? Is God no longer able to perform these miracles? Has He weakened with age? Was the enemy of our souls able to overcome the Creator of all things so that these miracles can't be performed now? Or is it our own fault? Have we come up short? Well, the enemy is certainly on the offensive, but God is not the target of the enemy. He knows he can't defeat God, but he can defeat us. If God is not moving as we think He should, you can be sure that He's not the one to blame. If there's a breakdown anywhere, it will always be found in us. We have the Bible as a record of the failures of God's people throughout the years. We are responsible to recognize our own behavior reflected in the pages of the Word of God. On many occasions, God's people came up short. As a result, they suffered for their own actions just as we currently suffer for ours. The gift of joy unspeakable is a promise and a gift from God to His faithful servants. Peace that passes understanding is a certainty for God's children. Miracles, gifts of healings, and discernment are all assured to those who are fully surrendered to God. So then, if these things are not currently a part of our lives, who's to blame? If we cry out to God and receive no answer, who's hindering the working of the Lord? The more we point our fingers at others or the situations we may find ourselves in, the more God directs us to His Word and the truth that our own behavior has built a wall between us and our Creator. We're talking about the spiritual benefits of serving God here. Numerous Bible quotations and incidents are not sparing in God's condemnation of vain worship. It has a long and shameful history, a history that is still in the making. We should use righteous judgment in identifying it, but to excuse it blindly only encourages it to the eternal fate of the practitioners. Now today, God has given us the opportunity to discern His perfect will concerning what it means to truly worship Him. This lesson is titled Vain Worship, but only so that we can recognize it and avoid it in our own lives. This lesson will serve as a warning and as a benefit to all who will receive it. If we will see the truth of the state of our own worship, we should be encouraged to draw closer to God so that He can lift us up. Love lifted me, so that He can lift us up out of the vain show of false worship that is accepted as normal behavior among the so-called Christians of today. Now's the only time we have. We can talk about what we've done in the past. We can consider what we might do in the future. But right now, this very moment is the only moment that we have that we can actually do anything about. The golden truth is John 4:23, "But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship Him." In order for us to worship God in spirit and in truth, we first must know what vain worship is. Make sure that we're not participating in it. Then we must remove all traces of it from our lives so that we can both be blessed and be a blessing to those around us. In Lesson Exposition Part 1, Jesus addresses true worship. Part A, general characteristics of worship. The Bible does not offer much description of worship here in this world. Bowing the head, bowing down to the earth, and rising up or standing are examples. In heaven, Revelation 4:10 and 11 and 5:8 through 14 is highly descriptive of true worship. I'm going to forego reading that right now for time's sake. Zondervan's dictionary says, Christian worship consists of preaching, reading of Scripture, prayers, singing, baptism, the Lord's Supper, and almsgiving. Sometimes there were prophesyings in tongues. It is immediately evident that any or all of these may be vain as well as true. The true Christian knows whom he worships and how to worship Him, and also when to worship Him. When is it a bad time to worship God? The majority would say that church time is the best time for worship. Perhaps some might even say, during family devotion time each day and personal prayer time, we need to spend time in worship to God. While these are important, they are nowhere near all-encompassing. In fact, the only time we should actually worship God is while we're breathing. It's the only reasonable time for us to spend any time worshiping God. Every word we speak, every choice we make, every action and reaction in our lives should all give glory to the one who gave us this breath in the first place. This is how the members of the early church behaved, and the results of their actions speak for themselves. Is this consistent with our lives? Are we experiencing the same kind of growth, spiritually and numerically for that matter? Are we seeing signs truly following us as believers? If we aren't, it's not God's fault. His assurance for our lives only stand as long as we uphold our end of the deal. God says, if you will, then I will. If you are willing to, then I will do this. If you will do that, I will do this. That's the way God works. We don't get to bargain with God and tell Him, well, I'm going to do this, but I want you to do that. That's not the way it works. We have to obey Him. We have to hear His Word. We have to read it so we know it, and then we have to understand it and apply it to our lives. Something that I've always liked history and shows that have to do with archaeology and the things that go along with our past, things that go back to even Bible times and those times. And one thing I've noticed, even though a lot of these presenters are very secular in their beliefs, and they have no belief in their own lives concerning any kind of religion, the fact of the matter is what they very clearly portray is the fact that regardless of the religion, regardless of what God they may be serving, the people that they're studying, what they say is there was no differentiation between the secular and the religious. These people, whatever they were doing it at all times. The Christians, if you look at the early church, they weren't Christians just when they were sitting in a congregation. They were Christians when they stepped out the door of their house. They were Christians when they sat down and ate. They were Christians wherever they were, whatever they were doing, God was first and foremost on their minds. There was no separation. In spirit and in truth, part B, John 4:22 and 24, ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. God is a spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. Worship in spirit must spring from the heart through the influence of the Holy Ghost. It is sincere, genuine, real. If it is in spirit, then it will also be in truth. It worships God in His fullness, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. In the Old Testament, lines were clearly drawn between God and the idolatry which surrounded His people. During the time of the New Testament, church, after Jesus ascended, it was much the same. These lines were very clearly drawn between what is God and what is idolatry. But today, sadly, and more detrimentally, idolatry is far more vague of an idea. While religions in some cultures still bow down to statues, it's not so much of an issue here in this country. But today, in this country, idolatry reigns in the hearts of many without so much as even an acknowledgement or an understanding that it could even possibly be so. Sports teams, celebrities, hobbies, video games, social media, television, politics, and many other things have taken the place of Moloch, Ashtoreth, Baal, Dagon, and a multitude of other false gods recorded in the Bible. We read in Ezekiel 23, 38, and 39, moreover, this they have done unto me. They have defiled my sanctuary in the same day, and have profaned my Sabbaths. For when they had slain their children to their idols, then they came the same day into my sanctuary to profane it. And lo, thus have they done in the midst of mine house. They were still worshiping God. They were still going to the temple like they were supposed to, but only in addition to the pagan gods around them, the pagan gods of those who surrounded them. We see our lives as having religious and secular aspects, just as I was saying earlier. During the time of the early church, this would have been accounted as having a divided heart. Every aspect of their lives was focused on God, and anything they did in the secular world was in order to bring God the glory and draw souls to Him. This concept is just as foreign to us as the daily miracles which the apostles and disciples witnessed as God worked through them. The continual power of God being manifested in their daily lives was a direct result of their absolute dedication to God and His perfect will at all times and in all things. If we do not see the miracles of the past, if we want to see those miracles of the past, we're going to have to do the same thing in our own lives. We're going to have to be as dedicated to God as those who came before us. True worship is rare. John 4:23, part C. But the hour cometh, and now is, when true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship Him. This is perceived in the fact that the Father must search for true worshipers. It must be acknowledged that we can be deceived concerning either the true or the vain. But God cannot be deceived. Ultimately, we must leave it to the individual to answer to God. However, if we know absolutely that an individual is not living right, we know that his worship is vain, for God does not bless the worship of wrongdoers. Since we know this fact to be true, how do our own lives measure up? I'm not talking about looking at one another. I want each one of us to look at our own lives, to look at ourselves. How has God been working for the benefit of souls in my life? How many miracles has God performed in my presence? How frequently have I witnessed healings of biblical magnitude, the lame walking, the blind seeing, the deaf hearing, those who are possessed by unclean spirits set free? This should be an eye-opening revelation to us concerning where we stand with God. Worship is more than raising your hands and crying while at church. It's a lifestyle that places God above every pleasure or pain in order to see Him lifted up above all else. Now, a couple of things came to my mind as I was working on this lesson, and this is just a couple of them here. A smoker is still a smoker even if he doesn't have a cigarette on his lips or in his pocket. There's constant evidence of the fact that that person smokes. A convicted felon is always a felon, whether he's behind bars or not. Even after his sentence is fulfilled, there is evidence that will follow him throughout his days. There are things that felons, even once they're released, that record follows them. They're going to have a hard time getting a job. There are certain things that convicted felons cannot do. Convicted felons cannot vote. These things follow them throughout their lives. These are evidences that continue to show long after they're gone. What about us? Is there enough evidence to prove that we serve Christ when we're at home or at work or in public? Are our choices all based on God's will and sought out in prayer to the Father? The evidence will proclaim our affiliations long before we open our mouths. Is God blessing your worship? Is God blessing my worship? If not, why not? These are things that we all need to think about. Part 2, Bible examples of vain worship. Exodus 32, 3 through 6, 17 through 19, and 35. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron, and he received them at their hand, and fashioned with a graving tool after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early on the morrow and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said unto Moses, There is a noise of war in the camp. And he said, It is not the voice of them that shout for mastery, neither is it the voice of them that cry for being overcome, but the noise of them that sing do I hear. And it came to pass as soon as he came nigh unto the camp that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot. And the Lord plagued the people because they made the calf which Aaron had made. Romans 1:21, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. 1 Corinthians 10, 6 and 7, Now these things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Part 3, let biblical history speak. Lessons abound in the passage from Exodus and are declared to be examples to the church by Paul's reference in Romans and 1 Corinthians. I'm going to bypass reading this in Exodus. There's a lot of important information there. I do suggest that you read that. Go ahead and skip on down to the next paragraph. Who were these vain worshipers? Alarmingly, they were God's chosen nation, a people who had every reason to know better. They were a covenant people who just days prior had promised to obey all that God had spoken to them through His voice out of the top of the mountain. Yet their worship was characterized by loud voices, shouting, singing, and dancing. Now, as I read several commentators on this particular passage in Exodus where they bowed down, worshiped the calf, several commentators linked this to bull worship in Egypt and the fornication that went along with this idolatry. They would have seen it. They would have seen these practices for generations in Egypt. And even though this was the very spot where they had heard the voice of God condemning such behavior, they moved forward in their own will against the God who had so recently and miraculously delivered them from slavery and hard bondage. Are we so different when we receive direction from God and refuse to submit ourselves fully to Him? Will we receive a lighter sentence for our actions? The writer of Hebrews tells us in chapter 10, verse 28 and 29, he that despised Moses' law died without mercy under 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much sorer punishment, suppose ye, shall he be thought worthy who hath trodden under foot the Son of God, hath counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. The choice is ours. God has granted us that freedom. He's given us the freedom of choice. Will we fully submit our lives to Him, or will we suffer the consequences? It is noteworthy that the outward forms and demonstrations of true worship can be learned and mimicked by vain, disobedient, and corrupt people. Now, the forms and appearance of true worship can be learned. You can see what other people do, and you can do the same thing. You can see other people raise their hands, and you can raise yours. You can see other people weep, and you can learn how to cry. And don't tell me people can't learn how to cry, because there's actors on TVs and movies that do it all the time. And they look serious. People who are involved in vain worship, they're serious. They don't even know that they're vain in their worship. They're just doing what they've seen other people do. When a child raises his hands and cries, is he truly feeling the Spirit? Or is he simply mimicking what he's seen in his parents? The truth will be seen without question by the fruit he bears outside of church. If we would spend just a little time each day inspecting our own fruit, we might just be able to determine our own shortcomings and lay them down at the foot of the cross. Amen. The enemy would have us fixate on the behavior of others. It's easy. It's so easy to say, well, look what this person's doing. Look what that person's doing. Well, if they're in church and they're behaving like this, I know I'm fine because I'm not acting that bad. It's easy for us to do that, but that's not what God would have us to do. If we allow the enemy this small victory, it will eventually cost us our eternal souls. True worship can only begin when our hearts are fully dedicated to God. Only then will we be able to serve Him for who He truly is. Only then will we have the potential to recognize when we begin to fall short. True worship comes from God and only flows through us on its way back to God. As stated earlier, unless we know an individual's life, often by the lifestyle, only spiritual discernment can tell the difference. By the sheer mercy of God and Moses' intercession, those false worshipers were spared total extinction or annihilation. Part 4, forms, substitutions, hypocrisies. I do want to point out here that this says 1 Timothy. That's actually 2 Timothy 3 and 5. Having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. from such turn away. Now I want to read this whole section just above that. This know also that in the last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. Now, the fact that this verse says these individuals have a form of godliness proves that these aren't the heathen, these aren't sinners out on the street. These are professing Christians who bear such sinful characteristics. It's no wonder that sinners exhibit such behavior. It's in their very nature. But for those who claim allegiance to the holy God to behave in this manner is of the utmost tragedy to the saved among them and the lost on the outside. The saved will be led astray by their actions and begin to take up their practices. The lost will see them as hypocrites and want no dealings with them, so that in all ways their confusion leads to an abundance of loss for themselves and for those whom they hope to save. Tragedy on top of tragedy, all wrapped up in a pretty bow called vain worship. Isaiah 1, 11, 13, and 15. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith the Lord? I am full of the burnt offerings of ram and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of lambs or of he-goats. Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. And when ye spread forth your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when ye make many prayers, I will not hear you. Your hands are full of blood. They were there in the tabernacle or the temple, performing the actions of the law, doing the things that they had promised to do. Yet their behavior went far beyond the law, in worshiping idols, in sacrificing their children to pagan gods, in dealing falsely in business practices, in fasting and giving alms in order to be seen of their peers, while enslaving their Israelite brothers and sisters. They could not see that their choices would bring consequences. They could not even accept that they had even done anything wrong in the first place, when it was pointed out to them with strong evidence. We may not sacrifice our children or enslave our brothers and sisters, but the lack of God's power among us testifies to our failures. We would each do well to cry out to God to reveal what's holding Him back from moving in our own lives, in our personal lives. When everything foreign is set aside, we will have no trouble seeing God moving among us. How will we respond to His directions when He gives them? Matthew 23 and 28. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, but have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Even so, ye outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. In the context of vain worship, the above verses of Scripture point at the vanity and abomination of substituting outward show for true worship. Now, when God is truly within and among His people, there will be no denying His power working among us. When God has full reign in our lives, He will show through. His power, His mercy, His works will show through. When we allow Him complete control, nothing will keep the floodgates closed to the masses of souls who will come our way. The peace that passes understanding and His unspeakable joy will be so contagious that our very presence will cause souls to cry out to God for mercy and deliverance. What are we waiting for? There is no way that the hypocrite can offer true worship, even if their deception should never be discovered by others. God is full up with such abomination. Our point in citing these verses is the hope of saving these deceivers from eternal damnation. I'm going to go ahead and read this. It's really short. Matthew 23:33 says, "Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell?" In a conclusion, it is beyond understanding why anyone would attempt to cover up a disobedient or evil life with an outward form of true worship. But Satan tempted even the Son of God to fall down and worship Him in exchange for all the kingdoms of the world. Incidentally, love and lust for the world and a worldly lifestyle appears to be the main reason for hypocritical worship. The soul's enemy cleverly uses the vain worship to entice others to follow suit. It's almost certain that some will reason, well, Brother John Doe or Sister Mary Doe always has great victory in their worship and praising God, and they feel free to do those things which the church teaches against. So why can't I? You can. But be prepared to pay the awful price of eternal loss. Vain worship is accomplished more than simply open hypocrites who know that they're in hypocrisy. Hundreds of souls, thousands of souls are deceived every day into believing themselves faithful servants. They see the trouble that they're facing in their own lives, and they put it off on something else. They say, well, it's not me, I'm going to church. We have to recognize what's the source of our worship. Why do we raise our hands? What is that feeling that we have when we start to cry? Is it mimicry? Are we just mimicking what we've seen? Are we doing what our parents did and their parents before them? Or are we sincerely serving God, not only while we're here in this building, but when we're sitting in our house, when we turn on the television, when we turn on the internet, whatever we're doing, when we're out shopping at Walmart? Are we still worshiping God with our behavior then? Or are we just doing that while we're here? Because if we're just doing it while we're here, we're only fooling ourselves. Vain worship
before you dismiss
is critically important for us to recognize. We have to recognize it and avoid it at all costs. Yes.
Vain worship is contagious.
It is. Absolutely.
We need the spirit of discernment.
Above all things.
Now, which is this here at the end of this lesson, Brother John Doe always has great victory in worshiping and praising God. Mm-hmm. We cannot identify that as the power of God.
Right. Yeah. Praise the Lord.
Now, Paul said he warned us of those having a form of godliness.
Right.
But denying the power thereof.
That's right.
We need a spirit of discernment to show us what is the power of God.
Right.
And what is not the power of God. From such turn away.
That's right.
It is contagious.
It's terribly contagious.
We cannot place our approval over the discerning spirit of God.
Right.
If we're not careful, our human instinct, our human reasoning, our human compassion will say, that's a good old soul.
Right.
What does the discerning spirit of God say? That's what we need.
We need the Spirit. We need the Spirit to guide us in everything that we see and everything that we say and everything that we do. God has the answers. We just have to be open to receive them.
Amen.
We have to be open to recognize fault in our own lives. I love the prayer that David prayed. Search me, O God, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the ways of everlasting. We need God's guidance. We can't make it through a single day. We can't make it through a single hour without doing His will, without seeking His guidance. I've said it before, but there are instances where God would have us to wear one pair of shoes rather than the other, because one pair you got to tie up and the other is just slip-ons. And it seems like an insignificant thing to us. But if we're led of the Spirit, it could be that putting on the one rather than the other leads us to a point where we can actually witness to a particular individual. I know that I'm just a little over here, but Sister Betty was talking about one time that she left the house and she went to go shopping, and she ended up at a grocery store at precisely the time when someone else was there who needed her testimony. And they saw her and recognized her face from the newspaper and said, "Oh, I love your article." And she was able to witness and testify to that individual. If she had left the house 30 seconds earlier, she never would have seen. If she'd have left the house 30 seconds later, she never would have seen this individual. Their paths never would have crossed. We have to be careful that we recognize God's will in every choice that we make. Now, I'm not saying we got to sit and pray for half an hour to determine whether we need to wear the loafers or the tie-up shoes, but we need to be sensitive to the Spirit of God. And if we are, then He will do those things. He will time our life in such a way that we can be the witness that we need to be, where we need to be, and we can do those things that He would have us to do. But we have to first be sensitive to His Spirit.